On May 1, 1950, a peaceful evening in the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska, was abruptly interrupted by a deafening explosion. A fireball rose into the air above the West Side Baptist Church, illuminating the evening sky. The building's steeple was severed by the blast and crashed onto nearby power lines, causing a cascade of sparks. The cables fell, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. As the debris settled, an eerie silence took hold. It was 7:27 p.m. The church's neighbors knew that the weekly choir practice was taking place at that hour. But they had no idea how many of their friends and neighbors were trapped beneath the ruins of the devastated church. In the 1950s, Beatrice, Nebraska, was a small town of about 11,000 people, served by several churches, including the West Side Baptist Church, located near the Big Blue River on the outskirts of downtown. This small wooden building housed a faithful and active congregation that regularly gathered for worship, Sunday school, and choir rehearsals. For nearly 30 years, Martha Paul had led the choir, which she had founded in 1920. Over the years, the group's composition often changed, but Martha had always ensured the choir remained active without major interruptions. She was proud of it and insisted that all members attend rehearsals diligently. She also placed great importance on punctuality. Rehearsals began precisely at 7:30 p.m., but she required everyone to be present by 7:25 p.m., not a minute later. This was a rule that the choir members generally followed without exception. It was rare for anyone to miss a rehearsal, and most arrived at the church either early or on time. That night, 16 people were expected at the rehearsal. Reverend Walter Klee was supposed to be present, as usual, accompanied by his wife and their daughter. That afternoon, he had stopped by the church to turn on the furnace so the building would be warm for the rehearsal. However, at dinner time, his daughter spilled something on her dress. Wanting to be properly dressed, the family delayed their departure to iron a new outfit. As a result, Walter Klee, his wife, and their 18-month-old daughter arrived late at the church. Lona Vander Gree, a high school student, usually arrived early for rehearsals. That evening, however, she was absorbed in a particularly complex geometry problem. Wanting to solve it before leaving, she postponed her departure until the last minute and therefore arrived late as well. Herbert Kipp, another choir member, was also caught up in a difficult task. He was writing a letter he absolutely wanted to mail before the last pickup. Despite repeated warnings from his mother that he would be late, he insisted on finishing his letter before leaving and also arrived after the scheduled time. Meanwhile, Royanna Estes and her sister Suddy had left home early enough to arrive on time, but their car refused to start. Frustrated, they called their friend Leona Vander, who agreed to pick them up after finishing her geometry homework. Unfortunately, since Leona was already running late, the Estes sisters were late as well. Lucille Jones, another high school student, was distracted by a radio program titled This Is Your Life. That evening, the guest was the famous ventriloquist Edgar Bergen, whom she greatly admired. Fascinated by the show, she delayed her departure to listen to the end. Her friend Dorothy Wood, with whom she always went to rehearsals, refused to leave without her. As a result, both girls were late as well. Leonard Schuster, usually punctual, had to stop by his mother's house to help her get ready for a missionary meeting. She and her daughter Susan therefore arrived late. Marilyn Paul, the choir director's daughter, fell asleep after an exhausting day and was only woken up by her mother at 7:15 p.m. They both hurried to get ready, but still left a few minutes late. Meanwhile, Harvey All was busy with his two children. He planned to take them with him to the rehearsal, but lost track of time while talking to them. When he realized he was late, he left the house in a rush, but it was already too late. As for Joyce Black, nothing had really delayed her except for the unusually cold weather that evening, which made her reluctant to go out. Since she lived very close to the church, she postponed her departure until the last moment. Later, she would attribute her delay, in her own words, to simple laziness. Finally, when she stepped outside her house, she was met with a terrifying sight. The church she should have already been inside was disintegrating in a monumental explosion. Stunned, she watched as burnt sheets of metal floated through the air and landed at her feet. Once her shock subsided, she headed toward the ruins of the church, fearing the worst for her fellow choir members. The neighbors, also in shock, rushed to the wreckage of the church. The explosion had shattered windows, cracked roofs, and damaged walls in nearby homes. Some residents were injured by shards of glass, while others felt the intense heat from the explosion. Many had initially thought the explosion had occurred in their own house. Normally, on a Wednesday night like this, a dozen people would have been inside the church at that time. Yet, to everyone's astonishment, all the choir members arrived at the scene after the explosion, one after the other. No one had been inside when the blast occurred. An investigation by local police quickly concluded that the explosion was caused by a gas leak that had reached the furnace. 2 cracked pipes were discovered not far from the church. The frozen ground had trapped the gas, which had flowed along a trench to the building, seeping inside before reaching an ignition source. The church was completely destroyed, and several nearby houses were severely damaged. Fortunately, insurance covered most of the repairs, and the church was rebuilt and still stands today. None of the choir members were injured in the explosion, and one witness who had suffered a heart attack from the shock fully recovered. The incident attracted national media coverage. Many were amazed by the improbable coincidence that had caused all the choir members to be late that night. Some spoke of divine intervention. Others wondered whether the choir was really as punctual as its members claimed. A few skeptics even speculated about possible insurance fraud, but no evidence of collusion was ever found. Whatever the case, for the 16 choir members, there was no doubt this extraordinary series of delays was nothing short of a miracle.